Harry spoke with Anderson Cooper about the emotional trauma following his mother's death and accused Camilla, now Queen Consort, of weaponizing the British press.
The palace has been shaken once again, but this time the storm comes from inside the royal family. In a sudden and emotional turn, Prince William has made a bold demand that no one ever expected. After a shocking discovery that left him stunned, he now wants Camilla completely removed from the picture. This dramatic decision has created fear, confusion, and whispers in every corner of the royal world. People close to the family say the atmosphere is tense and something very serious has happened. Join us because what William uncovered has changed everything. The secret file. William's phone buzzed with an urgent message. He was needed immediately in the East Wing's restricted archive room, a place rarely opened even for him. His footsteps echoed through the empty corridors as he made his way there, his mind racing with questions. What could be so urgent at this early hour? The palace still slept, wrapped in its usual morning quiet, but something felt different today. Something felt wrong. The heavy door opened with a soft click. Inside, the small room was bare except for a single desk and a computer screen glowing in the dim light. A sealed digital file sat waiting for him, marked with his name and today's date. No explanation, no context, just his name in bold letters. William sat down slowly, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. A strange feeling settled in his chest, part curiosity, part dread. He clicked open the file. The screen filled with documents, messages, and recordings. His eyes moved quickly over the first few lines, then stopped. He went back and read them again, more carefully this time. His hands grew cold. These were Camilla's private communications, months of them. Messages to palace staff, recordings of private conversations, decisions made behind closed doors. Each one told the same story, a pattern of deliberate actions designed to undermine him. William scrolled further, his breath catching in his throat. There were instructions to staff about limiting his access to certain meetings. Messages redirecting important palace matters away from his desk. Subtle changes to protocols that weakened his position as heir. But worse than all of this were the pages about Catherine. His wife's schedule had been manipulated. Her public appearances were quietly reduced. Her suggestions for royal engagements were dismissed before they ever reached him. There were even recordings of Camilla speaking to advisors about Catherine's influence, her tone sharp and dismissive. "She needs to understand her place." Camilla's voice came through one recording, cold and certain. William felt his world tilting. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a difference of opinion. This was calculated, planned, sustained over months, perhaps longer. He clicked through more files, each one adding another piece to a puzzle he never knew existed. Private meetings he was never told about. Decisions made in his name without his knowledge. A careful, patient effort to shift power while keeping him in the dark. His hands trembled slightly as he reached the final folder. Inside were photographs, images of Catherine at various palace events, her face marked with notes about her expressions, her interactions, her perceived weaknesses. Someone had been watching her, studying her, documenting everything. William pushed back from the desk, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. This was Camilla, his father's wife, someone who sat at family dinners, who smiled at public events, who spoke of unity and tradition. How long had she been doing this? How had he not seen it? The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick and hard to breathe. He thought about all the times things had seemed slightly off, meetings that never happened, messages that never arrived, opportunities that quietly disappeared. He had blamed confusion, miscommunication, and the natural chaos of palace life. But it wasn't chaos. It was designed. William stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds bathed in soft morning light. Everything looked the same as it always had. Beautiful, peaceful, perfect. But underneath that surface, something else had been growing, something dark and deliberate. His phone sat silent on the desk beside the glowing screen. He needed answers. He needed to understand the full scope of what had been done, But first, he needed to know something else. How long has this been going on, and who had helped her hide it? The inner circle. The whistleblower arrived within the hour, entering through a side entrance that few people knew existed. William had insisted on complete privacy, and now he understood why that mattered so much. She was a senior aide who had worked in the palace for nearly 15 years. Her face showed the weight of what she was about to reveal. Tired eyes, tense shoulders, the look of someone who had carried a heavy secret for far too long. They sat across from each other in the same small room where William had discovered the first file. The morning light had grown stronger now, but the room still felt cold and dim. "How deep does this go?" William asked quietly. The woman took a breath before answering. What she described next shattered everything William thought he knew about how the palace operated. Camilla had built her own private network over the years. Not the official staff everyone knew about, but a smaller, hidden circle of aides who answered only to her. They operated in the shadows of normal palace business, making quiet changes that seemed insignificant on their own, but created chaos when viewed together. These aides had access to schedules, correspondence, and decision-making processes. They would adjust things just slightly. Move a meeting here, delay a message there, redirect a question to someone else. Small actions that accumulated into something much larger. William listened as the whistleblower explained how his projects were systematically undermined. Proposals he submitted would be quietly edited before reaching the right people. Support he expected would mysteriously evaporate. Ideas he shared in confidence would somehow reach critics before supporters. Catherine's initiatives faced even worse treatment. Her charitable work was blocked at administrative levels. Her attempts to modernize certain royal traditions were met with sudden procedural obstacles. Her schedule was manipulated so she appeared less present, less engaged, less capable than she actually was. Every time the Duchess tried to move forward, invisible walls appeared, the whistleblower said softly. But the manipulation went beyond blocking their work. Camilla had been actively pushing her own agenda, using the same hidden network to advance causes and connections that served her interests. She positioned herself as the real power behind palace decisions, the one who truly understood tradition and duty. William felt his chest tighten as he absorbed this information. The whistleblower continued, describing something even more disturbing. Camilla had been leaking information, carefully selected details about palace matters, private family discussions, and internal disagreements. She fed these pieces to certain journalists and influential figures, always in ways that protected her while damaging others. Stories that made William look indecisive, articles questioning Catherine's commitment, whispers about family tensions that painted her as the patient peacemaker, while others appeared difficult or modern to a fault. She controlled the narrative, the whistleblower explained. She made sure people saw what she wanted them to see. William stood and walked to the window, his mind racing. How many news stories had he read that now seemed different in this light? How many public perceptions had been quietly shaped by someone he trusted to support the family? The whistleblower's voice broke through his thoughts. "There's one more thing you need to see." She pulled out a small drive and inserted it into the computer. "We call it the core file. It explains everything else, why she did this, what she was really working toward." William turned back to the screen as a new folder opened. His hands gripped the edge of the desk as he began reading. The document showed something that made his blood run cold. Camilla had been influencing Charles during his most vulnerable moments, times when his father was tired, uncertain, or grieving. She would wait for these moments and then gently guide conversations, suggest perspectives, plant doubts. There were recordings of private discussions where she subtly questioned decisions that honored the late Queen's wishes. "Perhaps that's too traditional for modern times," her voice suggested in one recording. "Maybe we should reconsider what she truly would have wanted." William saw evidence of her slowly reshaping his father's thinking on matters large and small. She praised Charles when he agreed with her views and created tension when he didn't. She isolated him from advisors who might offer different perspectives. But the worst discovery came in a series of messages from 2 years ago. William had tried to reconcile with his father during a particularly difficult period. He had written letters, requested private meetings, and reached out through trusted intermediaries. He remembered the silence that followed, the crushing feeling that his father wanted nothing to do with him. Now he knew why. Camilla had intercepted those attempts. Messages were redirected, never delivered, or edited to seem less sincere. Meeting requests were buried under scheduling conflicts that didn't actually exist. Intermediaries were told that Charles wasn't ready, that William needed to give it more time, that pushing now would only make things worse. "Your father never received most of your attempts to reach him," the whistleblower said quietly. William felt something break inside his chest. All those months of hurt and confusion. All those times he thought his father had rejected his attempts at peace. The growing distance between them seemed impossible to bridge. It had been manufactured, deliberately created by someone who benefited from their separation. He scrolled through more documents, each one revealing another layer of manipulation. Camilla had worked systematically to divide the family, to weaken the bond between father and son, to position herself as the only trusted voice in Charles's ear. She had twisted the crown's unity into something fractured and painful, and she had done it on purpose, with patience and careful planning. William thought about his grandmother, about the values she had spent her life upholding. Unity, duty, family. Everything she had worked to protect had been quietly torn apart by someone who smiled at family gatherings and spoke about tradition. The anger came then, hot and sharp, but underneath it was something deeper. A profound sadness for what had been stolen from all of them. Time they could never get back. Trust that had been broken. A father and son kept apart by lies. He closed the file and stood, his decision already made. This could not stay secret any longer. The truth had been hidden too long, causing too much damage. His father needed to know what had been done in the shadows of his own household. The family needed to understand how they had been manipulated. But most urgently, Charles needed to hear this from him before Camilla had a chance to spin it, to explain it away, to plant new doubts and shape a different narrative. A father's burden. William found his father in the private study, sitting in the chair by the window where he often retreated when the weight of the crown felt too heavy. Charles looked older than usual today, his face drawn with exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. William closed the door behind him and locked it. The sound made Charles look up, surprised by the urgency in his son's movements. Something in William's expression made Charles straighten in his chair. He had seen that look before, the same firm certainty that his own mother had possessed when something truly important needed to be addressed. William pulled a chair close and sat facing his father. For a moment, neither spoke. The study felt too quiet, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Charles broke the silence first, his voice barely above a whisper. He had been feeling something wrong in the palace for months, he admitted. Like a shadow he couldn't quite see but knew was there. William felt his throat tighten. His father had sensed it. Some part of him had known. He began explaining everything. The hidden files, the private network of aides, the manipulation of decisions and schedules. Charles listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with each revelation. William described how his own projects had been systematically blocked, how Catherine's work had been undermined at every turn. He explained the leaked information, the controlled narratives, the careful shaping of public perception. Charles' hands gripped the arms of his chair, but he remained silent. Then William reached the hardest part, the reconciliation attempts that had been intercepted. the messages his father had never received, the meetings that had been prevented through lies and misdirection. William's voice broke slightly as he explained how all those months he thought his father didn't want to hear from him, didn't want reconciliation. But Charles had never known William was trying to reach him at all. Charles stood abruptly, walking to the window. His shoulders were rigid, his breathing uneven. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. He had waited for William to reach out. He had thought his son had chosen distance. The realization of what had been stolen from them hung in the air like something physical and painful. Charles turned back to face his son, and William saw something he had rarely witnessed: his father on the verge of tears. But alongside the sadness was something else: recognition, the terrible understanding of someone who had suspected the truth but had been too afraid to look directly at it. Charles admitted he had seen signs, small things that didn't make sense, questions about decisions he didn't remember making. The staff acted strangely when he asked about certain matters. He sat down heavily, confessing that he had ignored them all. He had told himself he was imagining things, that stress was making him paranoid. William asked why, though he thought he already knew the answer. "Because I wanted peace," Charles said, his voice cracking. "After everything, the years of public scrutiny, the loss of your mother, the difficulty of finding my place, I just wanted something in my life to be simple." The admission settled between them like a weight. William felt anger and sympathy fighting inside his chest. His father had failed to protect them, but he had also been a victim of the same careful manipulation. William continued, needing his father to understand the full scope. Camilla had influenced him during his most vulnerable moments, when he was grieving, when he was uncertain about decisions. She had waited for those times and used them to reshape his thinking, to question the values he was raised to uphold. Charles closed his eyes, and a single tear slipped down his cheek. His mother would be devastated, he whispered. William agreed, but added that more than that, she would expect Charles to do something about it now. The silence that followed felt different than before, heavier, more purposeful. Charles sat with his head bowed, and William could almost see him wrestling with the truth, with his own complicity through silence, with the duty he had sworn to uphold. Finally, Charles looked up at his son, asking what he had allowed to happen to their family. William's answer was direct. Charles had allowed someone to divide them, to weaken them from within while they all tried to maintain appearances on the outside. He leaned forward, his voice growing stronger. What mattered now was the choice going forward. If Charles continued to allow this, if he stayed silent or tried to smooth things over for the sake of peace, it would destroy everything, not just their family, the entire monarchy. Charles flinched as if struck. William pressed on. The crown survived on trust and unity. When people discovered that the palace had been run by manipulation and lies, when they learned that the king allowed his wife to tear apart his own family, they would lose faith in the institution itself. Charles started to respond, but William cut him off. His father needed to hear this. The silence until now was understandable. Silence going forward would be unforgivable. Charles stood again, his face a mixture of pain and determination. He opened his mouth to respond. The door handle rattled. Then came a sharp knock. Camilla's voice cut through the room like ice, asking why the door was locked. Father and son locked eyes as footsteps approached from the other side of the door. The moment of reckoning had arrived earlier than either had expected. The performance ends. The door opened slowly, and Camilla stepped inside. Her face showed concern, perfectly measured and calm. She looked at Charles first, her expression softening in exactly the way she had practiced over years. She moved toward him with gentle steps, reaching out to touch his arm. Her voice was honey-sweet as she asked if he was all right. He looked so tired, she said, so troubled. She had been worried about him all morning. Charles stood frozen, unable to respond. The contrast between what William had just revealed and the tenderness in Camilla's voice was jarring, almost painful to witness. She continued speaking, her words carefully chosen. She suggested that Charles needed rest, that whatever was troubling him could wait. The stress of his position was too much sometimes, she said. He needed to take care of himself. William watched the performance with cold clarity. Every gesture, every concerned glance, every loving word. It was all part of the same manipulation he had seen documented in those files. She was doing it right now in front of him, as if he couldn't see exactly what she was doing. Camilla finally turned to acknowledge William, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, calculation, the awareness that something had shifted. But her voice remained sweet as she greeted him. She hadn't expected to see him here so early. Was everything all right? Charles found his voice then, quiet but firm. He asked Camilla to speak with William privately. There were matters they needed to discuss. Something changed in Camilla's face. The softness remained, but underneath it, William could see her mind working rapidly. She agreed immediately, of course. Whatever Charles needed, she would always support him. Charles left the room, closing the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded final. The moment they were alone, Camilla's entire demeanor transformed. The sweetness vanished like a mask removed. Her shoulders straightened, her expression hardened, and when she spoke again, her voice was cold and sharp as winter glass. "What have you been telling him?" William met her gaze steadily. He had told his father the truth, all of it. Camilla's eyes narrowed. She moved away from him, putting distance between them as if preparing for battle. Her next words came fast and defensive, each one carefully aimed. She denied everything. The files were fabricated, she insisted. Someone was trying to destroy her reputation, to turn the family against her. William had been deceived by people who wanted to create division. When William mentioned the recordings, her voice grew sharper. Those had been taken out of context, she claimed, twisted to sound like something they weren't. Anyone could make innocent conversations seem sinister with the right editing. She blamed the whistleblower, a disgruntled staff member with an agenda, someone who had been dismissed for incompetence and now wanted revenge. She blamed William's advisors. They had never accepted her, she said. They wanted to maintain old power structures and saw her as a threat to their influence. She even blamed Catherine indirectly, suggesting that some people in the palace couldn't handle a modern approach to royal duties. That resistance to change often looked like conspiracy when viewed through certain eyes. William listened to each excuse, each deflection, each attempt to rewrite reality. He said nothing, just watched her perform this desperate defense. His silence seemed to unnerve her. She changed tactics, her voice dropping to something almost pleading. She reminded him of how hard she had worked to support the family, to help Charles through difficult times, to modernize the monarchy's image. "Everything I've done has been for this family," she insisted. William finally spoke, his voice quiet but cutting. Everything she had done was for herself, for her position, her power, her control. Camilla's expression turned to ice. The pleading vanished, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. She warned him to be very careful about what he chose to believe. The palace operated in complex ways that he didn't fully understand yet. Actions that seemed questionable often served larger purposes. William took a step toward her. He understood perfectly well. She had built a network to manipulate decisions. She had blocked his work and targeted Catherine. She had kept him separated from his father through lies. Camilla's voice grew colder still. She told him he was making a terrible mistake, that pursuing this path would damage the monarchy in ways he couldn't imagine. Then came her final warning, delivered with perfect calculated precision. Removing her would break the family apart. Charles would never choose his son over his wife. The public would see it as William trying to seize power. The scandal would destroy everything the crown represented. "You think you're protecting the monarchy," she said, her voice like steel, "but you'll tear it down yourself." William held her gaze without flinching. The truth would no longer be buried. Not for appearances, not for peace, not for anything. He told her that she had spent years hiding her actions in shadows, controlling narratives, and manipulating the people who trusted her. But those days are finished. Camilla studied him for a long moment, searching for weakness or doubt. She found none. Her expression shifted one final time, settling into something between contempt and resignation. She straightened her jacket with deliberate movements and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back to look at him. Her voice was soft again, but this time the softness carried a threat rather than sweetness. She told him he had no idea what he had just started. Then she was gone, leaving William alone in the study. He stood there in the silence, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and the weight of what had just occurred. The confrontation had been necessary, but it left him feeling hollowed out and uncertain. His phone buzzed, a message from Catherine asking where he was. William left the study and walked through the palace corridors, his mind replaying every word of the conversation. When he reached his private quarters, Catherine took one look at his face and knew something profound had happened. She guided him to sit down, her hand steady on his arm. She asked what was wrong, her voice full of concern. William started to explain, but the words came out jumbled and incomplete. Catherine listened patiently, piecing together what had occurred. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke with absolute certainty. He needed to show the truth to the royal council, all of it. No more private confrontations or family meetings. This needed to be official, documented, and witnessed. The truth unveiled. The council chamber had never felt so heavy with tension. William stood at the head of the long table, surrounded by the monarchy's most senior advisors. These were men and women who had served the crown for decades, who had witnessed scandals and crises, who prided themselves on maintaining composure in any situation. But today, their carefully controlled expressions were cracking. William had called the emergency meeting with strict protocols. The doors were locked. No phones were allowed inside. Guards stood outside with orders that no one could enter or leave until the session concluded. He had brought everything: the original files, the recordings, the documented evidence of manipulation spanning years. He had organized it all the night before with Catherine's help, creating a clear timeline that even the most skeptical advisor couldn't dismiss. Now he presented it piece by piece, letting the evidence speak for itself. The first file showed the hidden network of aides and how they operated. Several advisors leaned forward, their eyes widening as they recognized names. People they had worked with, trusted, never suspecting a deeper loyalty. One senior advisor, Lord Pemberton, removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture William recognized as his way of processing disturbing information. The next section detailed the manipulation of palace decisions, how projects were blocked, how schedules were altered, how information was controlled and redirected. William watched as understanding dawned on faces around the table. Things that hadn't made sense before suddenly had an explanation. Lady Morrison, who oversaw royal communications, went pale as she saw evidence of leaked information. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned pages, recognizing stories she had tried to prevent, wondering how journalists had obtained details that should have remained private. Then came the recordings of Camilla's private conversations. Her voice filled the sealed room, speaking with cold calculation about limiting William's authority and reducing Catherine's public presence. The silence that followed was absolute. William moved to the most painful evidence: the intercepted reconciliation attempts between him and his father. He kept his voice steady as he explained how communication had been deliberately blocked, how a father and son had been kept apart through systematic deception. Lord Pemberton broke the silence, his voice rough with emotion. He had suspected something was wrong, he admitted. Small inconsistencies that troubled him, but that he couldn't quite prove. Decisions that seemed unlike the king's usual judgment. Advice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Other advisors began speaking then, their words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. They too had noticed strange patterns, questions about matters they knew had been resolved. Staff behaved oddly when certain topics arose. A sense that palace operations had become opaque in ways they couldn't define. Lady Morrison spoke about feeling shut out of communications she should have been managing. Lord Ashworth mentioned projects that ended for no clear reason. Dame Patricia described watching Catherine's excellent initiatives meet inexplicable resistance. "We feared her influence," Lady Morrison said quietly, "but we never had proof. And without proof, speaking up seemed like paranoia or politics." The admission hung in the air. These were the Crown's most experienced advisors, and they had all sensed the problem but felt powerless to address it. William understood their position, but he also felt anger at the collective silence that had allowed this to continue. Still, he kept his voice calm as he presented the final evidence. Documentation of Camilla's influence over Charles during vulnerable moments, her systematic undermining of the late Queen's wishes, her careful construction of power while appearing to support tradition. When he finished, the room remained silent for several long minutes. Advisors looked at each other, at the documents before them, at William standing at the head of the table with the weight of the monarchy on his shoulders. Lord Pemberton spoke first, addressing the reality they all now faced. Removing a queen consort was extraordinarily rare. The last time such action had been considered was centuries ago under vastly different circumstances. But, he continued carefully, it was possible. If the evidence showed actions that threatened the stability of the crown itself, if her continued presence posed danger to the institution, then procedures existed. The legal complexities would be significant, another advisor added. The public implications are enormous. The personal cost to the king was devastating. William listened to each concern, understanding their weight. Then he spoke with absolute clarity. He knew this would be difficult. He knew it would cause pain and scandal, but continuing to hide the truth would destroy the monarchy more surely than exposing it. The crown survived on trust, he reminded them. When that trust was built on manipulation and lies, it became hollow. Eventually, it would collapse. He looked at each advisor in turn. His grandmother had taught him that duty sometimes required impossible choices. This was one of those moments. "I'm ordering you to begin the formal process," William said firmly. "All of it. Documentation, legal review, preparation of evidence. I want everything done properly and thoroughly." The advisors exchanged glances. Then, one by one, they nodded their agreement. Lord Pemberton asked about timing. How quickly did William want this to proceed? William's answer was immediate. As quickly as possible while maintaining complete accuracy. Every day that passed with this hidden was another day of damage to the institution they all served. The meeting continued for another hour as they discussed procedures, legal requirements, and practical steps. William answered questions and provided additional context. The advisors took notes, asked for clarifications, and began mentally preparing for what would be an unprecedented situation. Finally, Lord Pemberton declared the meeting concluded. The advisors would begin their work immediately. Everything would remain confidential until the proper time for disclosure. As people gathered their materials and prepared to leave, William felt both relief and dread. The truth was now in motion. There would be no stopping it. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, Camilla worked quickly in her private office. She had sensed the shift in atmosphere, noticed the unusual meeting called without her knowledge, felt the change in how staff looked at her when they thought she wasn't watching. She opened her safe and removed several items, documents she had kept as insurance, recordings that could be damaging if discovered, evidence of her own careful planning. Her hands moved efficiently as she began destroying files. Papers fed into a shredder. digital files permanently deleted, physical evidence that could never be recovered. But as she worked, she didn't know about the backup copies, the duplicate files the whistleblower had made. The secondary recordings are stored in secure locations, the evidence that had been preserved before Camilla ever knew it existed. She shredded the last document and sat back, believing she had protected herself. She had weathered difficulties before. This would be managed like everything else, with careful words, strategic allies, and the appearance of wounded innocence. She had no idea it was already too late. That evening, a junior communications staffer made a phone call to a journalist friend, just sharing concern about unusual palace activity. Nothing specific. Just worry that something significant might be happening. The journalist, trained to sense stories, began making calls of her own. By midnight, 3 major news outlets had reporters investigating rumors of a crisis within the royal household. By morning, the first carefully worded articles appeared online. Nothing concrete, just questions. Speculation about unusual meetings, whispers of tension. When silence breaks, the palace gates were surrounded by sunrise. Cameras lined every possible angle. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder and satellite trucks blocked nearby streets. The whispers that had started as quiet rumors had exploded into deafening speculation across every news channel in the world. Headlines screamed questions nobody could answer yet. What was happening inside the palace? Why had senior advisors been in emergency meetings? Why did the king look so troubled at his last public appearance? The most persistent question was the simplest. What had Camilla done? She called trusted journalists, the ones who had always portrayed her favorably. She released a statement through her private secretary expressing confusion about the rumors and commitment to her royal duties. She appeared briefly in public, her face showing perfect concern and grace. She smiled at the cameras, waved gently, and seemed utterly unbothered by the growing storm. But her attempts to control the narrative felt hollow this time. Too many people had seen too much. Reporters who had protected her before now asked harder questions. Sources who had remained silent for years began speaking carefully about long-held suspicions. The media sensed blood in the water, and they weren't backing down. Charles became the story's most visible evidence that something had truly broken. At a scheduled engagement, cameras caught him standing noticeably apart from Camilla. Where they usually appeared together presented a united front. Now there was distance. Physical distance that viewers measured in feet. Emotional distance that showed in Charles's expression. Tired, troubled, and profoundly sad. When Camilla reached for his arm during a photo opportunity, he gently but clearly moved away. The gesture lasted only seconds, but cameras captured it from every angle. Within an hour, the clip had been viewed millions of times. Speculation intensified. Royal experts analyzed every interaction, every gesture, every absence. The palace's silence only fed the frenzy. Inside, William worked with the advisors on the official statement. Every word was debated, revised, and reviewed. The announcement needed to be clear but careful, honest but measured. It would change everything, and there would be no taking it back. The pressure was immense. William felt it in his chest, in his sleepless nights, in the constant awareness that the entire world was watching and waiting. Catherine became his anchor through it all. She stayed remarkably calm while chaos swirled around them. When William doubted the timing, she reminded him why this mattered. When he worried about his father's pain, she gently pointed out that truth was the only path to real healing. She sat with him during late-night revision sessions, offering perspective when the words became tangled. She made sure he ate, rested, and didn't lose himself in the overwhelming nature of what they faced. "You're doing the right thing," she told him during a particularly difficult moment. The hardest thing, but the right thing. William looked at his wife, grateful beyond words for her steady presence. The statement went through its final review. Legal had approved it. The king had seen it and given his painful consent. The advisors agreed it was as good as it could be. Lord Pemberton asked William if he was certain. Once released, there would be no going back. The world would know, and everything would change. William thought about his grandmother, about duty and truth, about the monarchy his children would inherit. He thought about all the damage that hiding the truth had already caused. He was certain. The communications team prepared for release. Journalists were alerted that a major palace statement was forthcoming. News channels went to breaking coverage, cameras focused on palace gates, and the world held its breath. The palace announced that Queen Consort Camilla would be stepping back from all royal duties, effective immediately. The truth revealed. The palace had chosen clarity over carefully constructed vagueness. The document laid out the facts with precision and dignity. Camilla had maintained a hidden network of loyal aides who operated outside normal palace structures. She had manipulated decisions affecting both William and Catherine's roles. She had leaked sensitive information to shape public narratives in her favor. Most damaging of all, she had systematically worked to keep Charles separated from his son during a crucial period of potential reconciliation. The evidence was summarized but not sensationalized. The tone was measured but unflinching. This was not a family argument made public. This was an official acknowledgement that someone in a position of trust had betrayed that trust in ways that threatened the institution itself. William appeared on camera 2 hours later to address the situation directly. He stood alone in one of the palace's formal rooms, his bearing straight and his voice steady. He spoke about duty and truth, about the difficult choice between protecting appearances and protecting the monarchy's integrity. He explained that hiding wrongdoing to maintain peace was not peace at all. It was slow destruction from within. His words were careful but powerful. He acknowledged the pain this revelation would cause, particularly to his father. But he made clear that the alternative, allowing manipulation and deception to continue, would have caused far greater harm. "The crown belongs to the people," William said, his eyes direct and honest. "When we fail to uphold the values we represent, we betray that sacred trust." He spoke about Catherine briefly, acknowledging that she had faced deliberate efforts to undermine her work and reputation. His voice carried quiet strength, as he described her grace under pressure that she hadn't even known she was facing. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Public support poured in from across the globe. People respected honesty, the willingness to confront a painful truth rather than hide behind tradition and silence. Social media filled with messages of support for William and Catherine. Commentators praised the courage it took to expose wrongdoing at the highest levels. Even those usually critical of the monarchy acknowledged that this kind of transparency was exactly what modern institutions needed. Within the palace, Camilla's world collapsed with stunning speed. Staff who had once rushed to fulfill her requests now moved slowly or found reasons to be elsewhere. Advisors who had sought her opinion stopped including her in conversations. Invitations to private dinners and social events quietly stopped arriving. The isolation was complete and deliberate. She had built her power on networks of loyalty and strategic relationships. Now those same networks dissolved as people distanced themselves from someone who had become toxic to associate with. She tried to maintain her routines, appearing for scheduled events as if nothing had changed. But the cameras caught everything. The way people stepped back when she approached, the conversations that ended when she entered a room, the cool politeness that replaced warmth. Her authority, once wielded with such careful precision, simply evaporated. Without the perception of power, the power itself ceased to exist. Charles withdrew from her completely. He moved into separate quarters and conducted his duties alone. When asked about his wife in a brief press encounter, his response was measured but telling. He was focused on his responsibilities to the crown and to repairing damage that had been done. The real healing began quietly, away from cameras and public statements. Charles and William started meeting regularly, often just the two of them in Charles's private study. They talked about the years that had been stolen through manipulation. They discussed the late Queen and what she would have wanted for the family. They worked through anger and hurt with honesty that had been impossible when lies stood between them. It wasn't easy. Some conversations were painful. Some silences were heavy with things that couldn't be undone. But they were talking, truly talking. For the first time in years, William brought Catherine to some meetings, and Charles saw clearly what Camilla had tried so hard to diminish: his daughter-in-law's wisdom, strength, and genuine care for the institution. He apologized to Catherine directly for not protecting her from treatment she should never have faced. The family began focusing on unity and healing, not the performative unity they had maintained for appearances, but real connection built on truth and mutual respect. Months passed. The media storm gradually calmed as new stories took precedence. The palace returned to its duties with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. One evening, William stood in the same room where he had first discovered the hidden files. So much had changed since that morning. The truth had been painful, but it had also been necessary. He thought about his future as king. The path ahead was clearer now, built on foundations that were honest and strong. He had learned that protecting the monarchy sometimes meant exposing its wounds rather than hiding them. Catherine found him there, understanding without words what he was thinking about. He turned to her and smiled. They had faced the storm together and emerged stronger. The crown would survive because someone had finally been willing to stand up and tell the truth, even when silence would have been easier.